The morning of Easter Sunday dawned with that particular clarity of light that seems to promise renewal, casting gentle shadows across the manicured grounds of the vicarage in St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple adjusted her knitting basket as she settled into a wrought-iron chair positioned strategically near the ancient yew hedge, from where she could observe the preparations for the annual Easter garden party, with the quiet attention of someone who had learned that human nature reveals itself most clearly when people believe themselves unobserved. The event had grown considerably in scope since Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth had taken charge 3 years prior, transforming what had once been a modest tea gathering into the village's premier social occasion, complete with elaborate floral displays, a miniature Easter garden tableau, and enough social intrigue to fuel conversations well into the summer months. Mrs. Ashworth herself moved through the preparations with the efficiency of a general organizing a campaign, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour, directing the placement of tables and the arrangement of spring flowers with an authority that brooked no contradiction. At 62, she remained one of the most striking women in the village, her late husband's considerable fortune having afforded her both the means and the confidence to establish herself as St. Mary Mead's unofficial social arbiter. Miss Marple noted how the woman's eyes lingered approvingly on young Timothy Fletcher, who was struggling manfully with a particularly obstinate Marquis Pole, his scholarly features flushed with exertion and what appeared to be nervous energy at finding himself the object of such attention. Dr. Gerald Pembroke arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, as was his custom, carrying his medical bag and wearing the slightly harried expression of a man who had already attended to 2 emergency calls before breakfast. His 20 years of service to the village had earned him a reputation for both discretion and dedication, qualities that Miss Marple had always found admirable in a medical man, particularly one who possessed the sort of observational skills that made him notice things others preferred to overlook. The garden gate creaked to admit Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's dear friend, accompanied by her house guest, Miss Vivian Cross, whose arrival in the village 3 weeks earlier had caused considerable speculation. Miss Cross was perhaps 40, with auburn hair styled in the latest London fashion and an air of sophisticated mystery that drew attention wherever she went. Her stated purpose of researching family genealogy seemed rather thin when weighed against her obvious interest in the village's current residents, particularly the younger men, though Miss Marple had observed that her attention seemed most focused on those with prospects, rather than those with merely charm. As the morning progressed, the garden filled with the gentle hum of village society at its most refined. Colonel Melchett and his wife arrived with their customary punctuality, followed by the Reverend Leonard Clement, who appeared somewhat overwhelmed by the transformation of his normally peaceful domain. Young Alistair Finch, the village solicitor, engaged various guests in animated conversation, his sharp wit and sharper tongue making him both sought after and slightly feared as a conversational partner. It was nearly 11 o'clock when the centerpiece of the celebration was unveiled, an elaborate Easter garden tableau, complete with a miniature tomb, carefully arranged moss, and delicate spring flowers, all displayed on a cloth-covered table in the center of the lawn. Mrs. Ashworth had spared no expense in creating what she clearly intended as the crown jewel of the festivities, and the assembled guests murmured their appreciation as they gathered around to admire the intricate details. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe not just the display, but the faces of those admiring it, noting how Miss Cross's eyes seemed to catalogue every detail with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest, how Timothy Fletcher's gaze kept returning to Mrs. Ashworth with an expression of barely concealed devotion, and how Dr. Pembroke's professional eye seemed to assess each person present with the sort of careful attention usually reserved for patients. The Easter egg hunt was scheduled to begin at 11:30, and excited children had begun to gather around Mrs. Ashworth for instructions when young Timothy Fletcher, in his eagerness to assist with the final arrangements, leaned over the Easter garden display to adjust one of the miniature figures. What happened next occurred so quickly that afterward, witnesses would disagree on the precise sequence of events, but the result was unmistakable. Timothy stumbled, reaching out to steady himself, and when the small crowd of onlookers had cleared away from the overturned table, they found him lying motionless among the scattered moss and broken flowers, his face bearing an expression of surprise that would remain frozen there forever. Dr. Pembroke was beside him instantly, his experienced hands seeking signs of life that were clearly absent, while Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen, her carefully orchestrated celebration transformed in a single moment from a scene of pastoral tranquility into something far more sinister. Miss Marple, her knitting forgotten in her lap, observed the faces around her with the sort of keen attention that had served her well in previous encounters with sudden death. Noting who looked genuinely shocked, who seemed frightened, and who appeared to be calculating the implications of this unexpected development. The Easter garden, meant to celebrate resurrection and renewal, had instead become the setting for a death that would prove to be neither accidental nor natural, though that particular truth would not emerge until Miss Marple had applied her considerable understanding of human nature to the puzzle of why a young man with everything to live for had died among the symbols of eternal life. The peculiar silence that follows sudden death settled over the vicarage garden like morning mist, muffling voices and movements as the reality of Timothy Fletcher's collapse transformed a festive Easter gathering into something altogether more sinister. Mrs. Ashworth, her composure cracking for the first time in memory, stood frozen beside the overturned Easter display, her hands trembling as she watched Dr. Pembroke complete his grim examination. When he straightened and shook his head with professional finality, the assembled guests seemed to exhale collectively, their holiday finery suddenly inappropriate against the backdrop of tragedy. The news spread through St. Mary Mead with the particular velocity reserved for truly shocking events. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had arrived uninvited but now found herself an essential witness, appointed herself the unofficial chronicler of events, holding court at the garden gate, where departing guests paused to share their theories. Her version emphasized Timothy's obvious devotion to Mrs. Ashworth, suggesting that unrequited love might have literally broken the young man's heart. Colonel Melchett, ever practical, dismissed such romantic nonsense in favor of a simpler explanation involving weak constitution and the excitement of the morning's activities. Dr. Pembroke maintained professional discretion, though his repeated examinations of the body and careful questions about Timothy's recent health suggested the matter might not be as straightforward as a simple collapse. When Inspector Slack arrived from the county headquarters, his methodical assessment of the scene and decision to preserve the area as a potential crime scene sent ripples of unease through the remaining observers. Miss Vivian Cross, who had recovered from her initial shock with remarkable composure, positioned herself where she could observe the inspector's work while offering helpful commentary to anyone within earshot. She mentioned having noticed Timothy seemed agitated that morning, though she attributed this to nervousness about the celebration rather than anything more significant. Her observations, delivered in that cultured London accent that both impressed and irritated the villagers, carried an undertone of authority that made others nod in agreement. Alistair Finch, the young solicitor, proved surprisingly knowledgeable about the legal requirements surrounding sudden death, advising Mrs. Ashworth on the necessary procedures while carefully avoiding any speculation about the cause. His professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask a certain tension, particularly when Inspector Slack began asking about Timothy's recent activities and associations within the village. The Reverend Clement, clearly distressed by the transformation of his Easter celebration, moved among his parishioners offering comfort while struggling with his own bewilderment. He confided to several trusted friends that Timothy had seemed unusually eager to help that morning, arriving early and insisting on personally arranging the Easter garden display. This information, combined with Mrs. Ashworth's visible distress, began to fuel speculation about the exact nature of their relationship. By tea time, the village had divided into distinct camps regarding Timothy's death. The romantic faction, led by Mrs. Price Ridley, favored theories involving unrequited passion and emotional collapse. The practical group, championed by Colonel Melchett, insisted on accidental death caused by clumsiness or medical weakness. A smaller, more suspicious contingent whispered about the convenient timing of the death and the presence of several visitors whose backgrounds remained mysteriously vague. Miss Marple, who had remained quietly observant throughout the afternoon's drama, found herself the recipient of numerous visits from neighbors eager to share their theories and gather her opinions. She listened with patient attention to each account, noting the subtle variations in detail and the way certain witnesses seemed eager to direct suspicion toward particular individuals while deflecting it from others. From her position near the yew hedge, she had observed several details that others had missed in their shock and confusion. Timothy's right hand had been positioned as if reaching for something specific rather than grasping randomly during a collapse. The Easter garden display, which Mrs. Ashworth had supervised so carefully, showed signs of hasty rearrangement that morning, with several elements placed differently than during the previous day's preparations. Most intriguingly, Miss Marple had noticed a small puncture mark on Timothy's neck, partially concealed by his collar, which Dr. Pembroke had dismissed as likely caused by a thorn during his fall. However, the nearest roses were several feet away, and the mark appeared too precise and clean to have resulted from accidental contact with garden vegetation. The discovery of an unusual blue foil wrapper among the scattered Easter eggs added another layer of mystery. Unlike the traditional hand-dyed eggs prepared by Mrs. Clement, this particular item appeared to be commercially manufactured and bore no resemblance to the rest of the display. When Inspector Slack questioned the preparation committee, no one could account for its presence. As evening settled over the village, the initial shock had given way to a more complex mixture of grief, curiosity, and growing suspicion. The Easter celebration, meant to symbolize renewal and hope, had instead introduced an atmosphere of uncertainty that would persist until the truth about Timothy Fletcher's final moments could be determined. Miss Marple, settling into her evening routine with a cup of tea and her knitting, reflected on the curious human tendency to reveal one's true nature most clearly during moments of crisis, and wondered what other secrets the day's tragedy might ultimately bring to light. The morning following Timothy Fletcher's tragic death brought Inspector Slack to St. Mary Mead with the methodical determination of a man who had learned not to trust first impressions, particularly in villages where social proprieties often conceal deeper currents of human motivation. His establishment of a temporary investigation headquarters in the vicarage study created an atmosphere of official gravity that seemed to settle over the entire village like morning frost, transforming casual conversations into guarded exchanges and turning routine activities into potential evidence of guilt or innocence. Dr. Pembroke's more detailed examination of Timothy's body had yielded disturbing revelations that transformed the case from a possible medical emergency into something requiring serious criminal investigation. The puncture mark on the young man's neck, initially dismissed as incidental contact with garden thorns, showed characteristics entirely inconsistent with natural causes. The wound was precise and clean, suggesting deliberate injection rather than accidental injury, while the rapid onset of Timothy's collapse indicated exposure to a fast-acting toxic substance that would have required both specialized knowledge and careful planning to administer effectively. The discovery of additional physical evidence further complicated the emerging picture of premeditated murder. A thorough search of the Easter garden area had revealed a missing hat pin from the parish jumble collection, its absence noted by the church volunteers who had helped with the display preparation. More significantly, chemical analysis of the blue foil wrapper found among the scattered decorations showed traces of an exotic alkaloid derived from South American plants, a substance not readily available through normal channels in rural England and requiring either extensive botanical knowledge or access to specialized sources. Miss Marple, maintaining her characteristic position as an interested but unobtrusive observer, had spent the morning conducting her own form of investigation through a series of seemingly innocent social calls. Her visit to the vicarage kitchen yielded valuable information about the Easter egg preparations, particularly the last-minute addition of 2 chocolate eggs wrapped in bright foil, contributed by an anonymous friend of Mrs. Ashworth's, according to conflicting accounts from various volunteers. The discovery that one of the hat pins used to secure the moss display had gone missing, combined with Timothy's unusual insistence on personally arranging the tableau, suggested a level of planning that extended beyond simple opportunistic violence. Inspector Slack's systematic interviews with the party attendees had begun to reveal the complex web of relationships and tensions that characterized village social dynamics. Mrs. Ashworth, while maintaining her composure with admirable dignity, showed subtle signs of anxiety that extended beyond normal grief, particularly when questioned about her recent private conversations with Timothy. Her admission that the young man had been pressing for discussions she considered inappropriate suggested motives that might extend beyond simple romantic attachment into areas involving more substantial stakes. Miss Vivian Cross proved surprisingly forthcoming about her observations of village relationships, offering detailed analyses of various residents' behaviors with an insight that seemed to exceed what a casual visitor might reasonably possess. Her comments about Timothy's apparent nervousness that morning were accompanied by pointed observations about tensions between him and other young men in the village, particularly Alistair Finch, whom she described as having watched Timothy with barely concealed animosity during the early preparations. The solicitor himself had responded to questioning with notable defensiveness, insisting that his interactions with Timothy had been minimal despite several witnesses recalling heated discussions between the 2 men at recent social gatherings. This contradiction became more significant when the village postmistress mentioned Timothy's recent inquiries about a small inheritance from a distant aunt, matters that would naturally have brought him into professional contact with the local legal representative. A particularly revealing development emerged from Inspector Slack's visit to the village chemist, where Mr. Pritchard recalled dispensing medical supplies on Friday to someone presenting a note supposedly from a doctor's surgery. The handwriting had not appeared to match Dr. Pembroke's familiar script, though the chemist admitted he could not swear to this observation with complete certainty. This information, combined with the discovery of a small syringe hidden among nearby flower bulbs, suggested a carefully orchestrated plan involving forged authorization and concealed preparation. Miss Marple found herself particularly intrigued by the overheard conversations Mrs. Bantry had witnessed between Mrs. Ashworth and Timothy in the vicarage study before the party began. The exchange involving Mrs. Ashworth's declaration that "you will have them back when it is proper," and Timothy's response that "they are not yours to keep," suggested a dispute over documents or property that might provide substantial motive for murder if the stakes were sufficiently high. The villagers' collective response to these developments revealed the characteristic patterns of human behavior that Miss Marple had observed throughout her long experience with sudden death and hidden secrets. Some residents showed eager willingness to embrace theories that cast suspicion on newcomers or social outsiders, while others demonstrated protective loyalty toward established members of the community, regardless of evidence. These reactions, she noted with interest, often revealed as much about the accuser's own relationships and resentments as about the actual circumstances of the crime. As evening approached and the investigation entered its 2nd day, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to reveal true character most clearly during moments of crisis. The careful social facades that normally governed village life were beginning to crack under the pressure of official scrutiny, exposing the complex motivations and long-buried grievances that might ultimately explain why a young man with everything to live for had died among the symbols of resurrection and eternal hope. By the 3rd day following Timothy Fletcher's murder, Inspector Slack had developed the sort of methodical confidence that comes from assembling what appears to be an airtight case against an obvious suspect. His temporary headquarters in the vicarage study had become a repository of evidence that pointed with increasing certainty toward Alistair Finch, the village solicitor whose defensive responses and apparent financial entanglements with the victim had transformed him from a peripheral figure into the central focus of a murder investigation that seemed to be resolving itself with satisfying clarity. The financial motive that emerged from Inspector Slack's inquiries proved far more substantial than anyone had initially suspected. Timothy Fletcher's inheritance from his great-aunt Millicent, originally described as a modest bequest suitable for a young scholar, had in reality amounted to nearly £3,000, along with several pieces of valuable antique jewelry that represented generations of family wealth. More damaging still was the discovery that Timothy had recently become aware of significant discrepancies in the estate settlement, irregularities that suggested systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate legal fees and administrative costs. Alistair's initial attempts to minimize his professional relationship with Timothy crumbled under persistent questioning, revealing a pattern of questionable practices that extended well beyond the Fletcher inheritance. Inspector Slack's examination of the solicitor's office, records uncovered unauthorized borrowing from client accounts, fictitious billing for services never rendered, and a complex web of financial manipulations that had allowed the ambitious young lawyer to maintain a lifestyle considerably beyond his legitimate means. Timothy's growing awareness of these irregularities, combined with his increasingly insistent demands for full disclosure and independent verification of his inheritance's true value, had created a situation where exposure would have meant not only professional ruin, but likely criminal prosecution. The physical evidence supporting the case against Finch proved equally compelling. The missing hatpin from the parish jumble collection was discovered in a hedgerow near his office, bearing microscopic traces of the same exotic alkaloid found in Timothy's bloodstream. More significantly, the chemist Mr. Pritchard's recollection of the customer who had presented the forged prescription for medical supplies included details about handwriting that, while deliberately disguised, bore the formal, studied quality characteristic of legal documents. The green-black ink used in the forgery matched perfectly the permanent stains that habitually marked Alistair's fingers from his constant use of an expensive fountain pen that he carried as a mark of professional distinction. The consolidation of village opinion around Alistair's guilt followed the predictable pattern of communities seeking resolution for disturbing events that threatened their sense of security and social order. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had previously favored romantic explanations for the tragedy, now recalled numerous instances of suspicious behavior from the solicitor, while Colonel Melchett declared himself satisfied that proper application of English justice would soon restore peace to St. Mary Mead. Even Dr. Pembroke, typically cautious in his professional assessments, admitted that Alistair's access to medical supplies through various estate settlements involving deceased clients would have provided opportunities to acquire the exotic poison used in Timothy's murder. The discovery of Timothy's private correspondence provided additional support for the prosecution's emerging narrative. Letters found in his modest lodgings revealed his growing suspicion about the handling of his inheritance and his determination to seek independent legal advice from a firm in the county town. His final letter, written on the evening before his death, explicitly threatened to expose what he termed systematic theft disguised as legal procedure unless full restitution was made within 48 hours. Creating a timeline that placed maximum pressure on his suspected killer precisely when the Easter celebration would provide optimal cover for murder. Despite the apparent strength of the case against Alistair Finch, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by aspects of the crime that seemed inconsistent with both the character and capabilities she had observed in the young solicitor during their various social interactions over the past year. Her concerns centered particularly on the sophisticated nature of the murder method, which required not only access to exotic botanical materials, but also precise knowledge of dosages and delivery techniques that seemed beyond the expertise of a village lawyer whose criminal activities had been limited to relatively straightforward financial fraud. The careful timing required to ensure Timothy's collapse at the precise moment of maximum dramatic impact suggested a level of psychological manipulation and theatrical planning that seemed inconsistent with Alistair's generally direct, if unscrupulous, approach to problem-solving. Miss Marple had observed that the solicitor, for all his sharp intellect and occasional ruthlessness in business matters, possessed a certain transparency in his emotions and reactions that made him poorly suited for the sort of cold, calculated deception that Timothy's murder had required. More intriguingly, the specific choice of poison struck her as revealing characteristics that didn't align with Alistair's known interests and capabilities. The exotic alkaloid derived from South American plants represented specialized botanical knowledge that would more likely belong to someone with scientific training or extensive travel experience, neither of which applied to a village solicitor whose interests lay firmly within the confines of legal texts and local politics. The focus on Alistair's obvious guilt had caused most observers to overlook several behavioral inconsistencies among other party attendees that Miss Marple found increasingly significant. Miss Vivian Cross's remarkably detailed knowledge of village relationships and financial circumstances seemed excessive for someone who had allegedly arrived only 3 weeks earlier for genealogical research. Her pointed observations about various residents' behaviors, delivered with calculated timing and apparent innocence, suggested access to information that would have required either extensive prior investigation or ongoing communication with established sources within the community. Mrs. Ashworth's reaction to Timothy's death, while appropriately grieved on the surface, had included moments of what appeared to be relief rather than pure sorrow, particularly when discussing the young man's recent behavior and his increasingly insistent demands for private conversations about matters she preferred to keep confidential. Her visible tension when Inspector Slack questioned her about the nature of these discussions suggested complications that extended beyond simple philanthropic concern for a promising young scholar. As Inspector Slack prepared to formally charge Alistair Finch with murder, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to accept simple explanations for complex crimes, particularly when those explanations confirmed existing prejudices about character and social position. The case against the solicitor was certainly compelling from a conventional investigative standpoint, but her long experience with village secrets and concealed identities suggested that the most obvious suspect was not always the most dangerous one. The true murderer, she suspected, remained hidden like a shadow at noon, deliberately obscured by the very obviousness of the case being constructed against an admittedly guilty but ultimately innocent man. The morning of the 5th day brought Inspector Slack's announcement that charges against Alistair Finch would be formally laid by week's end, a proclamation that settled over St. Mary Mead like a familiar blanket, offering the comfort of resolution to a community eager to return to its accustomed rhythms. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the very tidiness of this conclusion, recognizing in it the sort of convenient simplicity that often concealed more complex truths about human nature and criminal behavior. Her concerns crystallized during what appeared to be a routine morning visit to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement had discovered a peculiar item while salvaging the Easter decorations. Among the scattered petals and ribbons lay a small glass vial, no larger than a thimble, bearing traces of crystalline residue and wrapped in tissue paper that bore the unmistakable watermark of an expensive London stationer. The vial itself was of laboratory quality, precisely graduated and designed for measuring minute quantities with scientific accuracy that far exceeded anything a desperate village solicitor might reasonably be expected to possess. The discovery prompted Miss Marple to arrange what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a small gathering to compare recollections of the Easter celebration, though her true purpose involved the sort of gentle psychological observation that had served her well in previous encounters with concealed guilt. The invitations, written in her characteristic neat hand, went out to Mrs. Ashworth, Dr. Pembroke, Alistair Finch, Miss Vivian Cross, and Reverend Clement, each framed as an opportunity to discuss recent events in comfortable surroundings where social proprieties might encourage unguarded revelations. They came with the punctuality that village society demanded, each bringing their own particular tension to Mrs. Bantry's drawing room. Mrs. Ashworth arrived in dove grey again, though notably without the blue sash she had worn on Easter morning, explaining with careful casualness that she had sent it for cleaning after some unfortunate snagging near the vicarage hedge. Miss Cross brought chocolates from London, their bright foil wrappings prompting Miss Marple's seemingly innocent observations about modern packaging and the curious things one might conceal beneath such attractive surfaces. The conversation, guided with the delicacy of a skilled conductor, touched upon hat-pins and their various uses, drawing from Miss Cross the revelation of her preferred implement, a small mother-of-pearl button-hook with a slender stem that she demonstrated with practiced ease. Dr. Pembroke, coaxed by gentle flattery, described his lecture to the Women's Institute on exotic plant-derived compounds, noting with professional precision that a single pinprick, correctly delivered, could prove remarkably effective in experienced hands. These seemingly casual exchanges yielded revelations that cast the established narrative in an entirely different light. Mrs. Ashworth's admission that her late husband had collected botanical specimens in South America, combined with her nervous acknowledgement that some had been lodged with Dr. Pembroke for identification, suggested access to the sort of exotic materials that had been used in Timothy's murder. More significantly, Alistair's production of a carbon copy showing his preemptive contact with county auditors regarding the Fletcher estate demonstrated a transparency entirely inconsistent with calculated murder. The most telling moment came when Miss Marple produced what she claimed was a hatpin found in the church hall, observing each person's reaction to her request that someone take charge of it. While others declined or offered practical suggestions, Miss Cross reached for it with the careful precision of someone who understood the difference between an ordinary pin and one bearing traces of dangerous substances, before Miss Marple's fluttered change of mind prevented the actual transfer. The afternoon's revelations were punctuated by small but significant observations. The green-black ink stain that appeared on Mrs. Bantry's napery where Miss Cross had rested her glove, the faint medicinal scent that accompanied her movements, and her evasive response when questioned about her family origins. These details, combined with the postmistress's earlier description of telegrams from a London investigation firm rather than genealogical societies, began to paint a picture of someone whose presence in St. Mary Mead served purposes far more complex than family research. The discovery that evening of Alistair's ransacked office, with papers scattered and the Fletcher account ledger missing, provided the final confirmation of Miss Marple's growing suspicions. The theatrical nature of the break-in, so different from the methodical financial fraud that characterized the solicitor's actual crimes, suggested someone who understood the value of misdirection and the power of obvious evidence to obscure more sophisticated criminal activities. As she walked home through moonlit lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to accept simple explanations for complex crimes, particularly when those explanations confirmed existing prejudices about character and social position. The exotic poison, the precise timing, the careful manipulation of evidence, and the presence of someone with both the knowledge and resources to orchestrate such an elaborate deception pointed toward a perpetrator who understood not merely chemistry and botany, but the deeper currents of human psychology that made certain individuals perfect scapegoats for more calculating criminals. The case against Alistair Finch, while compelling in its surface details, now seemed designed primarily to distract attention from activities requiring far greater sophistication than a village solicitor's desperate embezzlement. The true murderer, Miss Marple suspected, remained hidden in plain sight, protected by the very obviousness of the evidence against their chosen scapegoat and confident in their ability to manipulate both official investigation and village opinion toward the conclusion that best served their own, carefully concealed purposes. The 6th day following Timothy Fletcher's murder brought an unexpected discovery that would transform Miss Marple's understanding of recent events in St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived at Danemead Cottage with the breathless urgency of someone who had stumbled upon something simultaneously illuminating and disturbing. Clutching a small leather-bound diary that had been wedged behind a loose board in her guest room, the very chamber where Miss Vivian Cross had been residing for the past 3 weeks. The diary, written in Timothy Fletcher's careful scholarly hand, revealed observations that painted an entirely different picture of village life than anything that had emerged during Inspector Slack's methodical investigation. Timothy had been conducting his own quiet inquiry, not merely into his inheritance, as everyone had assumed, but into what he described as systematic deception involving multiple parties and purposes far beyond simple financial fraud. His entries documented a young man whose academic instincts had been aroused by inconsistencies that others had dismissed as mere coincidence, revealing a mind that approached problems with the same methodical precision he brought to his historical research. Most significantly, Timothy had recorded a series of late-night meetings between Miss Cross and Mrs. Ashworth, encounters that directly contradicted both women's claims of minimal acquaintance. His careful observations, made from his lodgings overlooking the vicarage garden, described exchanges of documents and what appeared to be heated discussions about items that must be returned to their rightful owners and reputations that could not survive certain revelations. These nocturnal conferences had increased in frequency during the week preceding the Easter celebration, suggesting an urgency that extended well beyond the social planning that both women had claimed occupied their time. The diary also contained Timothy's growing suspicions about Miss Cross's true identity and purpose in the village. His methodical research, conducted through correspondence with London libraries and genealogical societies, had revealed no record of the family history she claimed to be investigating. More disturbing still were his discoveries about her previous residences, establishing a pattern of brief stays in prosperous villages, followed by unexplained departures that coincided with local scandals involving prominent families and mysteriously missing valuables. Armed with this information, Miss Marple arranged what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a morning call to Mrs. Ashworth, finding that lady in her morning room surrounded by correspondence that she hastily concealed upon her visitor's arrival. The conversation that followed, conducted with the delicate precision that Miss Marple had perfected over decades of village observation, gradually revealed the true nature of the relationship between the two women and the circumstances that had led to Timothy Fletcher's death. Mrs. Ashworth's composure, so carefully maintained throughout the official investigation, finally began to crack under Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning about her late husband's collection of South American artifacts. The revelation that several valuable pieces had gone missing during the chaos following his death, items that she had assumed were simply misplaced during the estate settlement, took on new significance when combined with Miss Cross's specialized knowledge of such objects and her access to collectors willing to pay substantial sums for authentically documented pieces. The criminal scheme that emerged from this conversation was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Miss Cross, operating under various identities and armed with impressive credentials as an art and antiquities appraiser, had been systematically identifying and acquiring valuable objects from recently widowed women who lacked the expertise to recognize their true worth. Her method involved establishing herself as a helpful friend, gradually gaining access to family collections, and then either purchasing items at a fraction of their value or simply removing them during the confusion that typically surrounded estate settlements. Mrs. Ashworth had initially been a willing participant, grateful for Miss Cross's apparent expertise in valuing her late husband's collection and eager to convert unwanted artifacts into more practical assets. The arrangement had seemed mutually beneficial until Timothy's inheritance inquiry had brought him into contact with London appraisers who recognized several items from photographs as pieces that had been reported missing from various estate sales over the past 2 years. Timothy's discovery of this connection had transformed him from an inconvenient witness into a genuine threat to both women's carefully constructed lives. His scholarly integrity and naive belief in the power of truth had made him immune to the sort of financial inducements that might have silenced a more worldly observer. His determination to expose what he saw as systematic fraud against grieving widows had left Miss Cross with limited options, all of which required his permanent silence. The murder method, Miss Marple now understood, had been chosen not merely for its exotic nature, but for its symbolic appropriateness. The South American alkaloid represented the very artifacts whose theft had motivated the crime, while the precise botanical knowledge required for its preparation demonstrated the sort of specialized expertise that Miss Cross had cultivated throughout her criminal career. The Easter garden setting had provided perfect cover for the injection, with Timothy's collapse easily attributed to natural causes or accident until a more thorough investigation revealed the true nature of his death. The theatrical elements of the crime, from the carefully planted evidence against Alistair Finch to the dramatic timing of Timothy's collapse, reflected Miss Cross's understanding that successful deception required not merely concealing the truth, but providing an alternative narrative that satisfied observers' need for logical explanation. The solicitor's obvious guilt in financial matters had made him a perfect scapegoat, while the exotic nature of the poison had distracted attention from the more mundane motives underlying the murder. The ransacking of Alistair's office, Miss Marple realized, had been the final piece of this elaborate misdirection. The theatrical clumsiness of the break-in, so different from the methodical financial fraud that characterized the solicitor's actual crimes, bore all the hallmarks of deliberate staging designed to reinforce his apparent guilt, while destroying any remaining evidence that might point toward the true conspiracy. Mrs. Ashworth's role had evolved from willing accomplice to terrified co-conspirator, her social position and reputation making her vulnerable to Miss Cross's threats, while her intimate knowledge of the village's social dynamics made her an invaluable asset in planning Timothy's murder. The blue sash that had snagged in the hedge during her nervous reconnaissance of the crime scene had provided the final physical evidence linking her to the conspiracy, though Miss Marple suspected that her participation had been motivated more by desperation than greed. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human capacity for self-deception that allowed otherwise respectable people to rationalize increasingly serious crimes as necessary responses to circumstances beyond their control. The path from simple fraud to calculated murder had been paved with small compromises and mounting desperation, each step seeming logical when viewed in isolation, but leading inevitably toward a destination that neither woman could have imagined when their association first began. The morning following her discovery of Timothy's diary brought Miss Marple to the realization that direct confrontation would serve little purpose with adversaries as sophisticated as those she now suspected. Instead, she embarked upon what she described to Mrs. Bantry as a series of neighborly calls, though her true intention involved the sort of methodical observation that had served her well in previous encounters with calculated deception. Her first visit took her to Mrs. Ashworth's morning room, where she found that lady surrounded by correspondence and wearing the distracted air of someone whose carefully ordered world had begun to show disturbing cracks. The conversation that followed, conducted with Miss Marple's characteristic blend of gentle interest and shrewd observation, gradually revealed the extent of Mrs. Ashworth's nervous preoccupation with matters extending far beyond simple grief over Timothy's death. Her hands trembled perceptibly when the discussion turned to her late husband's collection of South American artifacts, a collection she had recently and rather hastily decided to donate to a regional museum. The decision, she explained with obvious relief, would eliminate the overwhelming task of proper cataloguing, a burden that Miss Cross had graciously offered to share with her considerable expertise in such specialized matters. Miss Marple's subsequent visit to the vicarage yielded additional fragments of information that began to form a more complete picture of the conspiracy she suspected. Mrs. Clement, still flustered by the disruption of their Easter celebration, mentioned the mysterious disappearance of several items from the church hall, including a distinctive silver button hook that had been used to secure some of the more elaborate floral arrangements. The piece was quite old, she explained, a family heirloom with particular sentimental value, making its absence all the more distressing. More significantly, she recalled Timothy's unusual insistence on including a specific variety of moss in the Easter garden display, a rare black spleenwort that he claimed possessed symbolic significance, though she had wondered at the time where he might have obtained such an uncommon specimen. Armed with these observations, Miss Marple decided upon a more direct approach that would allow her to observe both suspects simultaneously under controlled conditions. She extended invitations to Miss Cross and Mrs. Ashworth for afternoon tea at Danemead Cottage, framing the gathering as an intimate opportunity to find solace in companionship after the recent unpleasantness that had so disrupted their peaceful village life. Mrs. Bantry, delighted by the prospect of company, prepared her finest china, entirely unaware of the delicate psychological examination her friend intended to conduct. The atmosphere in Miss Marple's drawing-room initially maintained the strained politeness characteristic of social gatherings overshadowed by recent tragedy. Miss Cross arrived impeccably dressed and radiating her customary air of cultured charm, making appropriate conversation about the beauty of the English countryside and the resilience of village communities in times of crisis. Mrs. Ashworth, however, displayed visible signs of nervous tension, her gaze alternating between Miss Marple and Miss Cross as though seeking guidance for navigating conversational waters that might conceal dangerous depths. Miss Marple, playing the role of gracious hostess with consummate skill, gradually steered the discussion toward topics she knew would resonate with the hidden knowledge she had begun to assemble. She spoke thoughtfully of the curious ways in which secrets eventually surface, recalling a case from her youth where a woman's true identity had been revealed through a single piece of distinctive jewelry. From her mantelpiece, she retrieved a small carved wooden figurine, a South American artifact her nephew Raymond had sent years earlier, using it to launch a seemingly innocent discourse on the fascinating histories such items often possessed and the importance of proper authentication in determining their true value. The conversation's direction clearly affected both women, though in markedly different ways. Miss Cross maintained her composed smile, but Miss Marple detected a subtle tightening around her eyes and a fractional pause before she smoothly agreed about the prevalence of unscrupulous individuals ready to exploit those less knowledgeable about such specialized matters. Mrs. Ashworth's discomfort was more obvious, manifesting in the nervous rattling of her teacup against its saucer and frequent glances toward her companion as though seeking reassurance or instruction. When Miss Marple turned her attention to praising Mrs. Ashworth's efforts with the Easter garden display, she made particular mention of having noticed an unusual fern among the moss, identifying it as black spleenwort, a species rarely found in English gardens. Her casual observation that Dr. Pembroke kept a pressed specimen in his study visibly startled Mrs. Ashworth, who stammered that she hadn't particularly noticed the botanical details. Miss Cross, however, interjected with practiced smoothness, explaining that Timothy had been quite the amateur botanist and must have added the specimen himself, though Miss Marple caught the almost imperceptible glance she directed toward Mrs. Ashworth, a silent communication that spoke of shared secrets and coordinated deception. The discussion's progression to the police investigation and the general consensus regarding Alistair Finch's guilt provided Miss Marple with the opportunity for her most pointed observations. She expressed sympathy for the young solicitor's situation while noting that his unorthodox financial methods seemed inconsistent with the precise, scientific mind required to orchestrate such a sophisticated crime. The murder, she suggested with deceptive mildness, demonstrated the sort of specialized knowledge and careful preparation that indicated a very particular kind of intellect, one perhaps more accustomed to detailed analysis and the subtle art of distinguishing authentic value from clever imitation. This carefully crafted observation produced the reaction Miss Marple had been seeking. Miss Cross's composure wavered for a crucial moment, her eyes narrowing and a faint tremor passing through her hand as she reached for a biscuit. The response was so subtle and quickly masked that only someone with Miss Marple's lifetime of observing human nature would have recognized it as the flash of a cornered predator momentarily revealing the steel beneath her velvet exterior. The tension that had been building throughout the afternoon reached its climax through an apparently accidental incident that provided the final confirmation Miss Marple required. When Mrs. Bantry bustled in with fresh hot water, Miss Cross's handbag slipped from its precarious position on the sofa arm, spilling its contents across the carpet. Among the usual feminine articles, a small silver button-hook rolled into view, its elegant surface marred by a dark stain that bore suspicious resemblance to the residue Miss Marple had observed in the glass vial found among the Easter decorations. Miss Cross's haste in retrieving her belongings, combined with the flush that colored her cheeks, confirmed what the physical evidence had already suggested. As the afternoon concluded and her guests departed with carefully maintained social pleasantries, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to reveal true character most clearly under pressure. The psychological examination had yielded precisely the confirmation she had sought, establishing not only the identity of Timothy's killer, but the sophisticated nature of the deception that had been employed to misdirect suspicion toward an innocent, if morally compromised, scapegoat. The stage was now set for the final confrontation that would expose the full extent of a conspiracy rooted in greed, sustained by manipulation, and culminating in cold-blooded murder disguised as village tragedy. The challenge that remained involved not merely proving guilt, but ensuring that justice would be served, despite the careful planning and social respectability that had nearly allowed the true criminals to escape detection. Miss Marple settled into her evening routine with the quiet satisfaction of someone who understood that patience, observation, and an intimate knowledge of human nature could ultimately triumph over even the most carefully constructed deception. The 8th day following Timothy Fletcher's murder brought Miss Marple to the realization that direct confrontation would prove insufficient against adversaries as sophisticated as those she now suspected. The discovery of Timothy's diary had provided crucial evidence, but she recognized that accusations without irrefutable proof would likely result in denials and further obfuscation. Instead, she required a more delicate approach, a subtle psychological examination that would compel the guilty parties to reveal themselves through their own reactions and defensive maneuvers. Her strategy involved what she described to Mrs. Bantry as an informal gathering to discuss village history, a seemingly innocent premise that would appeal to Mrs. Ashworth's sense of social responsibility while providing Miss Cross with no obvious reason for alarm. The invitation, written in her characteristic neat hand, requested their presence at Danemead Cottage for an afternoon discussion about local families and their historical connections, a topic that would naturally allow for careful probing into matters of inheritance, valuable collections, and the proper documentation of ownership. The drawing room at Danemead Cottage had been arranged with Miss Marple's customary attention to detail, each chair positioned to allow optimal observation of her guests' reactions while maintaining the comfortable atmosphere of a social call. Mrs. Ashworth arrived punctually, her appearance betraying the strain of recent events despite her attempts to maintain composure. Miss Cross followed shortly after, radiating her usual cultured charm, though Miss Marple detected a subtle tension in her posture that suggested heightened alertness rather than casual social engagement. The conversation began with appropriately gentle topics touching upon the village's rich history and the fascinating stories that emerged from old family collections. Miss Marple spoke thoughtfully about the curious ways in which valuable items sometimes found their way into unexpected hands, particularly during the confusion that typically surrounded estate settlements. Her observations, delivered with characteristic mildness, clearly resonated with both women, though their reactions differed significantly in both nature and intensity. Mrs. Ashworth's discomfort manifested in nervous fidgeting and frequent glances toward her companion, as though seeking guidance for navigating conversational waters that might conceal dangerous depths. Miss Cross maintained her polished exterior with greater success, though Miss Marple noted the subtle tightening around her eyes and the way her hand remained positioned near her handbag throughout their discussion. The crucial moment arrived when Miss Marple produced what she claimed was an old village ledger, explaining that she had discovered it while organizing her own family papers. The leather-bound volume, actually Timothy's diary carefully disguised, contained what she described as fascinating details about local families and their historical connections. Her casual mention of discovering information about missing heirlooms and questionable ownership transfers prompted an immediate and revealing exchange of glances between her guests. As she began reading selected passages, carefully edited to reveal Timothy's growing suspicions without immediately exposing the full extent of his discoveries, Miss Marple observed the mounting tension with professional interest. Miss Cross's attempts to minimize the significance of the historical parallels required her to demonstrate knowledge of estate procedures and appraisal methods that seemed excessive for someone engaged in simple genealogical research. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple produced the small glass vial found among the Easter decorations, holding it up to catch the afternoon light as she spoke about the precision required for certain specialized activities. Her gentle observation that such implements suggested someone with scientific training or extensive experience in handling delicate materials prompted Miss Cross to shift uncomfortably, her cultured accent sharpening slightly as she attempted to redirect the conversation toward safer topics. The breaking point came with Miss Marple's casual placement of the silver button hook on the table between her guests, explaining that she had found it in the church hall and wondered about its proper owner. Mrs. Ashworth's involuntary gasp and Miss Cross's sharp look of reproach revealed the true dynamic of their relationship with unmistakable clarity. The elegant criminal who had orchestrated such sophisticated deception found herself exposed not by external evidence, but by her own instinctive reaction to protect her carefully constructed facade. Miss Cross's composure finally cracked when Miss Marple mentioned Timothy's correspondence with London appraisers, revealing his discovery of systematic fraud involving multiple estates. The transformation was remarkable, her polished exterior giving way to cold calculation as she demanded to know exactly what evidence Miss Marple possessed and what she intended to do with her suspicions. The predatory intelligence that had made her crimes possible now worked against her, revealing the ruthless nature that had motivated Timothy's murder. Mrs. Ashworth's terrified reaction to her companion's unveiled hostility provided the final confirmation Miss Marple required. The older woman's obvious fear extended beyond simple guilt into genuine terror of someone whose protection had transformed into a deadly threat. Her stammered attempts to maintain innocence while simultaneously pleading for understanding revealed the complexity of a relationship that had evolved from willing collaboration into coercive control. The afternoon's revelations established not only the identity of Timothy's killer, but the sophisticated nature of a criminal enterprise that had nearly succeeded through careful manipulation of village social dynamics and official investigative procedures. Miss Cross's expertise in psychological manipulation had served her well in previous schemes, but her confidence in controlling all variables had led to the overreach that would ultimately ensure her downfall. As the confrontation reached its climax, Miss Marple reflected on the curious human tendency to reveal true character most clearly under pressure. The elegant facade that had concealed a calculating predator had finally crumbled, exposing the steel beneath the velvet and confirming her suspicions about the true nature of Timothy Fletcher's murder. The stage was now set for the final revelation that would expose the full extent of a conspiracy rooted in greed, sustained by manipulation, and culminating in cold-blooded murder disguised as village tragedy. The morning of the 9th day brought Miss Marple to the realization that the time for gentle observation had passed, and what remained required the sort of calculated psychological pressure that would compel the guilty to reveal themselves through their own defensive reactions. She arranged what she described to Reverend Clement as a small gathering in the vestry to discuss certain papers of Timothy Fletcher's that had recently come to light, matters that might be best resolved within the circle of those directly concerned with the Easter arrangements. The announcement, carefully worded to seem innocuous to most while proving compelling to precisely 2 individuals, would serve as the stage for her final examination of human nature under pressure. Inspector Slack arrived with reluctant cooperation, his confidence in the case against Alistair Finch somewhat shaken by Miss Marple's persistent questions and the accumulating evidence that suggested a more sophisticated criminal mind than a desperate village solicitor might possess. Dr. Pembroke positioned himself near the outer door at Miss Marple's gentle suggestion, while Mrs. Bantry settled into a nearby pew with her knitting, lending an air of homely normality to proceedings that would prove anything but ordinary. The vestry, with its ancient wooden panels and lingering scents of beeswax and old silk, provided the perfect setting for what Miss Marple intended as her final test of the theories that had been forming throughout her careful observation of village behavior following Timothy's death. On the table, she had arranged what appeared to be Timothy's personal effects, a blue-ribboned packet tied with twine, a small posy of primroses secured with a brass pin, and the silver button-hook that had played such a crucial role in recent events. Mrs. Ashworth arrived first, punctual by habit, but pale with the strain of recent events, her dove-grey attire and dark gloves creating an impression of mourning that seemed entirely appropriate for the occasion. Miss Cross followed shortly after, radiating her customary cultured charm while maintaining the alert composure of someone who expected to direct the terms of any conversation. Her removal of one glove to adjust her hat revealed the distinctive ring with its dark oval stone, while the other glove remained in place as though by casual oversight. Miss Marple began with appropriate observations about Timothy's methodical nature and his habit of keeping careful records, mentioning almost casually that he had maintained detailed correspondence with certain gentlemen in London regarding matters of authentication and provenance. Her gentle handling of the primrose posy provided the opportunity for seemingly innocent remarks about the precision required when using pins on delicate stems, noting how a steel point, if treated or prepared with certain substances, might carry more than a simple puncture wound. The crucial moment arrived when Miss Cross, assuming practical responsibility with her characteristic efficiency, reached toward the blue packet with her gloved hand, then checked herself and produced the silver button-hook from her handbag. Her use of the implement to nudge the twine rather than touching it directly revealed the sort of careful caution that spoke of extensive experience with dangerous materials. The faint violet smear that transferred from the ribbon to the button-hook surface caught Dr. Pembroke's professional attention, while the dry medicinal scent that rose from the contact provided confirmation of Miss Marple's suspicions about the weapon used in Timothy's murder. Miss Cross's attempt to explain the staining as contact with ribbon dye demonstrated the sort of quick thinking that had served her well in previous deceptions, but her knowledge of fabric properties seemed oddly specific for someone engaged in simple genealogical research. More revealing still was her instinctive glance toward the place where collar met throat when Miss Marple spoke of precision placement and minimal visible damage, a reaction that betrayed intimate familiarity with the murder method. The psychological pressure intensified when Miss Marple mentioned that London auditors would be arriving to collect certain ledgers that Timothy had felt necessary to preserve until the proper authorities could examine them. The reference to hidden documentation caused Mrs. Ashworth to emit a small, distressed sound while Miss Cross's hand tightened visibly on her handbag, revealing the expensive London stationer's tissue paper that lined its interior. Mrs. Ashworth's breaking point came when she stepped between Miss Cross and the table, finally making the choice between continued complicity and moral redemption that had been tormenting her throughout the investigation. Her whispered thanks for Miss Marple's offer of Christian charity represented not merely gratitude, but the relief of someone who had been trapped by circumstances that had spiraled far beyond her original intentions. The transformation in Miss Cross was immediate and unmistakable, her polished exterior giving way to cold calculation as she recognized that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Her suggestion that confusion should be prevented, accompanied by the quick movement of the button hook to slice through the packet's twine, revealed the predatory intelligence that had made her crimes possible while demonstrating her willingness to destroy evidence even under direct observation. Inspector Slack's intervention at this crucial moment, his hand covering the packet while simultaneously noting the telltale violet stain on Miss Cross's glove, provided the official authority necessary to transform psychological revelation into legal evidence. Dr. Pembroke's professional offer to examine the stain, declined with a nervous laugh that failed to reach her eyes, confirmed the medical significance of the residue that had betrayed her guilt. The final piece of evidence came with Miss Marple's production of the blue ribbon found near the yew hedge, its medicinal scent providing unmistakable confirmation of the exotic alkaloid used in Timothy's murder. The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by Mrs. Ashworth's forlorn sound of relief and the faint scraping of Miss Cross's ring against the table's oak surface, leaving a violet trace that would serve as the final proof of her guilt. Miss Marple's gentle observation that villages possessed eyes where gentlemen thought there were none, and memories where ladies believed there were only forgettings, provided the perfect summation of how careful observation and understanding of human nature could ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated criminal deception, setting the stage for the complete revelation that would expose the full extent of the conspiracy that had led to Timothy Fletcher's death. The vestry held the peculiar silence that follows revelation, dust motes dancing in afternoon light that seemed to illuminate more than mere physical space as Miss Marple prepared to untangle the final threads of a conspiracy that had nearly succeeded through its very sophistication. Inspector Slack stood with newfound respect for the elderly lady, whose patient observations had exposed what his methodical police work had missed, while Dr. Pembroke positioned himself strategically near the door, understanding that medical attention might soon be required for more than physical ailments. Miss Cross maintained her elegant composure with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to controlling situations through charm and manipulation, though Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her posture that suggested a predator recognizing the approach of a more dangerous hunter. Mrs. Ashworth trembled visibly, her dove-gray attire and dark gloves creating an impression of mourning that would prove more prophetic than anyone had initially realized. Miss Marple began with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades observing human nature in all its complexity. The crime, she explained, had originated not with Timothy's inheritance, but with a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been operating across multiple counties for several years. Miss Cross, operating under various identities and armed with impressive credentials as an art and antiquities appraiser, had been systematically targeting recently widowed women who possessed valuable collections but lacked the expertise to recognize their true worth. The method was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its effectiveness. Miss Cross would establish herself as a helpful friend and knowledgeable expert, gradually gaining access to family treasures while maintaining the sort of cultured respectability that deflected suspicion from her activities. Her victims, grateful for assistance during their time of grief, rarely questioned her assessments or the modest prices she offered for items she claimed were of limited value. Mrs. Ashworth had initially been a willing participant, relieved to have expert guidance in dealing with her late husband's extensive collection of South American artifacts. The arrangement had seemed mutually beneficial until Timothy's inheritance inquiry brought him into contact with London specialists who recognized several pieces from photographs as items reported, missing from various estate sales over the preceding 2 years. Timothy's discovery had transformed him from an inconvenient witness into a genuine threat to both women's carefully constructed lives. His scholarly integrity and determination to expose what he saw as systematic exploitation of grieving widows had made him immune to financial inducements, leaving Miss Cross with limited options that ultimately required his permanent silence. The murder itself had been planned with meticulous attention to detail that reflected Miss Cross's understanding of both chemistry and psychology. The exotic alkaloid, derived from specimens in Mrs. Ashworth's late husband's botanical collection, required precise knowledge to extract and prepare. The weapon was Miss Cross's own silver button hook, its slender point allowing for a clean injection that would leave minimal visible evidence. The crucial moment had come during the Easter celebration when Timothy leaned over the garden display. Mrs. Ashworth, acting under coercion rather than willing cooperation, had pinned a primrose boutonniere to his collar, creating the perfect opportunity for Miss Cross to deliver the fatal injection with her prepared button hook. The young man's collapse appeared to be a simple accident or medical emergency, with the poison's rapid action ensuring he could not identify his attacker. The subsequent cover-up had demonstrated Miss Cross's sophisticated understanding of criminal investigation procedures. The planted evidence against Alistair Finch, from the hatpin bearing traces of the exotic alkaloid to the forged prescription that implicated him through handwriting analysis, had been carefully designed to take advantage of his obvious guilt in financial matters. The theatrical ransacking of his office had provided the final touch, suggesting desperate attempts to destroy incriminating evidence while actually eliminating any documentation that might point toward the true conspiracy. Miss Cross's expertise in psychological manipulation had served her well throughout the investigation, allowing her to direct suspicion toward obvious targets while maintaining her position as a helpful observer whose insights seemed to confirm the official narrative. Her detailed knowledge of village relationships and financial circumstances, initially attributed to careful observation during her brief residence, had actually resulted from systematic research conducted before her arrival. The physical evidence that had accumulated throughout Miss Marple's patient investigation now formed an irrefutable pattern of guilt. The blue ribbon with its medicinal scent, the violet stain on Miss Cross's glove that matched the residue found in the glass vial, the silver button hook with its telltale traces of exotic alkaloid, and Timothy's own diary documenting his growing suspicions about systematic fraud involving multiple estates. Mrs. Ashworth's breaking point came with Miss Marple's gentle observation that villages possessed eyes where strangers thought there were none, and memories where criminals believed there were only forgettings. The older woman's collapse into tearful confession provided the final piece of evidence necessary to ensure conviction, her detailed account of the conspiracy's development confirming every aspect of Miss Marple's methodical reconstruction. As Inspector Slack formally arrested Miss Cross for Timothy Fletcher's murder, her elegant facade finally cracked to reveal the cold calculation beneath. Her parting glance toward Mrs. Ashworth carried a mixture of fury and contempt for someone whose weakness had ultimately undone their carefully laid plans. The aftermath brought a curious mixture of relief and unease to St. Mary Mead, the village's sense of security restored through the exposure of guilt, while simultaneously shaken by the realization that sophisticated evil could masquerade so effectively behind cultured respectability. Miss Marple, gathering her belongings as evening settled over the ancient stones, reflected on the eternal human capacity for both great kindness and terrible cruelty, noting that the difference often lay not in opportunity, but in the fundamental choice between serving oneself and serving something greater than personal gain. The weeks following the arrest of Miss Vivian Cross brought to St. Mary Mead the peculiar mixture of relief and unease that accompanies the resolution of crimes which have shattered comfortable assumptions about village life. Inspector Slack departed with expressions of grudging admiration for Miss Marple's methods, though his official reports would emphasize the methodical police work rather than acknowledge that an elderly spinster's understanding of human nature had proved more valuable than conventional investigative procedures. The true scope of Miss Cross's criminal enterprise emerged gradually through coordination with authorities across multiple counties, revealing a sophisticated operation that had victimized dozens of recently widowed women over several years. Her method had remained remarkably consistent. Careful research into family circumstances, establishment of credible credentials as an antiquities expert, and patient cultivation of trust that allowed her to acquire valuable items at fractions of their worth. The discovery of forged documents, false references, and a network of complicit dealers painted a picture of calculated predation that extended far beyond the borders of their peaceful village. Alistair Finch emerged from custody with his reputation permanently tarnished, despite his innocence of murder. The revelation of his financial irregularities ensured his legal career would never recover, making him a cautionary tale of how moral weakness could render someone vulnerable to more calculating criminals. His departure came without fanfare, a quiet acknowledgement that some stains prove impossible to remove regardless of technical innocence in more serious matters. Miss Marple observed his leaving with characteristic compassion, understanding that his embezzlement, while wrong, paled beside the cold-blooded manipulation that had nearly destroyed him. Mrs. Ashworth's fate proved more complex. Her tearful confession revealed a woman trapped by initial greed into complicity with increasingly desperate crimes. The legal system treated her with appropriate leniency given her coerced participation in Timothy's murder, but the quiet judgment of St. Mary Mead would prove more enduring than any court sentence. She quietly sold her house and departed for Bath, making arrangements that spoke of both penance and gratitude for mercy received. Her donation of the remaining artifacts to a regional museum, properly documented and accompanied by a letter acknowledging past mistakes, represented an attempt at restitution that could never fully restore what had been lost. Timothy Fletcher's grave, marked by a simple stone near the ancient yew where he fell, bore an inscription chosen by Reverend Clement about truth exposing what loves darkness. Mrs. Clement tended it personally, having grown fond of the young scholar whose integrity had ultimately cost him his life. The Easter garden itself was quietly redesigned, the primroses replanted in different patterns, while the exotic black spleenwort was removed to a proper frame in the church hall, labeled with dry humor as being on loan from Dr. Pembroke. The village's collective response followed predictable patterns that Miss Marple had observed throughout her long experience with sudden death and hidden secrets. Some residents expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, while others mourned the loss of innocence that comes with recognizing how effectively evil can masquerade behind cultured respectability. Mrs. Price Ridley's recollections reconfigured themselves to emphasize her supposed suspicions about Miss Cross, while Colonel Melchett declared himself satisfied that proper English justice had prevailed, though he offered Miss Marple a respectful nod that acknowledged more than his words would admit. Dr. Pembroke's professional analysis of the exotic alkaloid revealed the sophisticated botanical knowledge required for such precise murder. The poison, derived from specimens in Mrs. Ashworth's late husband's collection, had required not only access to rare plants, but detailed understanding of extraction and preparation techniques that demonstrated extensive research and planning. The murder weapon itself, Miss Cross's silver button-hook, had been chosen for its ability to deliver a clean injection while appearing entirely innocent. As autumn approached and immediate shock began fading into memory, the village gradually resumed its accustomed rhythms, though subtle changes reflected the lasting impact of recent events. People passed each other in the high street with slightly increased kindness, the sort that attends shared fright survived. The postmistress kept parcels longer when recipients were away. The butcher included extra bones without charging, and younger girls looked less eagerly toward London, having learned that sophistication could conceal dangers as readily as opportunities. Miss Marple, characteristically modest about her role in exposing the conspiracy, returned to her knitting and garden with quiet satisfaction. Her patient observation of behavioral inconsistencies and psychological patterns had proved that villagers possess their own forms of wisdom, accumulated through generations of watching human nature in all its complexity. She reflected often on Timothy's final expression of surprise rather than fear, as though in dying he had learned something about people that might have made him kinder to their weaknesses had he lived. The case would remain in her memory as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who understand how to exploit the better instincts of their victims, transforming trust and grief into opportunities for systematic exploitation. Yet she took comfort in observing that evil, however cleverly disguised, ultimately reveals itself to those patient enough to watch and wise enough to recognize that respectability lies not in manners or money, but in the habit of doing one's duty when no one is watching. Toward evening, Miss Marple sometimes stood by her gate, watching light settle over the cottages, reflecting that wickedness is rarely a stranger in a black cloak, but rather a familiar guest who knows exactly where the good silver is kept, and that the eternal struggle between good and evil plays out in communities large and small, resolved not by dramatic gestures, but by the quiet persistence of ordinary decency practiced by those who understand that observation without charity becomes merely prying. The months following Miss Vivian Cross's arrest brought to St. Mary Mead the gradual restoration of peace that comes when justice has been served, and truth has finally emerged from beneath layers of careful deception. The trial, conducted with the methodical precision that English courts bring to serious criminal matters, had concluded with a verdict that surprised no one who had followed Inspector Slack's presentation of evidence. Miss Cross received a sentence that reflected both the calculated nature of her crimes and the particular cruelty involved in exploiting grieving widows during their most vulnerable moments. Mrs. Ashworth's cooperation with authorities had resulted in a more lenient sentence, though the court's mercy could not restore her position in village society. She departed St. Mary Mead quietly in early autumn, selling her house to a young family from London who knew nothing of its recent history. Her final gesture was a substantial donation to the Parish Restoration Fund, accompanied by a letter expressing remorse and gratitude for the community's restraint in judgment. Miss Marple, observing her departure from behind her cottage curtains, reflected that true repentance often manifested itself in actions rather than words. Alistair Finch's fate proved more complex, his innocence of murder overshadowed by his guilt in financial matters. The revelation of his embezzlement had destroyed his legal career beyond any hope of recovery, forcing him to seek employment as a clerk in a distant town where his name carried no unfortunate associations. His departure came without ceremony, a reminder that moral weakness, while different from calculated evil, could prove equally destructive to those who indulged in it. The criminal network that Miss Cross had operated was systematically dismantled through cooperation between multiple county forces, revealing the true scope of her predatory activities. Dozens of families across England learned that items they had sold for modest sums were worth considerably more than they had been told, while several London dealers found themselves facing uncomfortable questions about their acquisition practices. The recovery of stolen artifacts provided some measure of justice for victims who had assumed their losses were merely unfortunate rather than criminal. St. Mary Mead absorbed the lessons of recent events with the quiet wisdom that characterizes communities that have survived shared trauma. The parish council instituted new procedures for verifying the credentials of visiting experts, while local solicitors began requiring additional documentation for estate settlements involving valuable collections. These changes, implemented without fanfare, reflected the village's determination to protect itself from future exploitation while maintaining the openness that made rural life appealing. The vicarage garden, scene of so much recent drama, was quietly redesigned by Mrs. Clement with assistance from several village ladies. The Easter display, when it appeared the following spring, emphasized native English flowers and traditional symbols of resurrection, avoiding exotic elements that might carry unwelcome associations. Timothy Fletcher's grave, marked by a simple stone bearing an inscription about truth and courage, was tended with increasing care by various villagers who had come to see him as a symbol of integrity maintained despite personal cost. Dr. Pembroke used the case as the basis for several lectures to regional medical societies about exotic poisons and the importance of thorough examination in cases of unexpected death. His pressed botanical specimens now carried additional labels warning about the potential dangers of seemingly innocent plants when handled by those with criminal knowledge. The exotic black spleenwort, once displayed proudly in his study, was quietly removed to a locked cabinet, its beauty overshadowed by its association with calculated murder. As winter settled over the village, bringing the sort of crystalline mornings and early evenings that made St. Mary Mead particularly beautiful, the community found itself changed in subtle but significant ways. People passed each other in the high street with slightly increased warmth. The sort of kindness that follows shared danger survived through mutual support. The postmistress held parcels longer when recipients were delayed. The butcher included extra bones without charge, and younger residents looked less eagerly toward London, having learned that sophistication could conceal dangers as readily as opportunities. The Christmas season brought gatherings that felt both familiar and renewed. Village traditions maintained but infused with deeper appreciation for the bonds that held the community together. Miss Marple, arranging holly in her sitting room while snow dusted the garden paths, observed how even the most shocking events eventually became part of the village's collective story, transformed from immediate trauma into lasting wisdom about human nature and the vigilance required to protect the innocent. The case had reinforced Miss Marple's long-held understanding that the most dangerous criminals are often those who present themselves as the most helpful and cultured members of society. Miss Cross's sophisticated manipulation had nearly succeeded precisely because she understood how to exploit the better instincts of her victims, transforming trust and grief into opportunities for systematic exploitation. Yet the ultimate failure of her schemes had demonstrated that evil, however cleverly disguised, eventually reveals itself to those patient enough to observe and wise enough to recognize the difference between genuine respectability and its carefully constructed imitation. Timothy Fletcher's death, while tragic, had served a purpose beyond his own scholarly pursuits, protecting other potential victims from Miss Cross's predatory schemes, while reminding the village that moral courage, though dangerous, remained essential for maintaining the sort of community where decent people could live without fear. His example had inspired several promising young residents to pursue careers in law or medicine, determined to serve justice in their own professional capacities. As spring returned to St. Mary Mead, bringing with it the annual renewal of gardens and the gentle resumption of outdoor social activities, Miss Marple continued her daily routines of knitting, gardening, and careful observation. The village had emerged stronger and wiser from its encounter with sophisticated evil, though she understood that vigilance must remain constant. Human nature, she had learned through long experience, contained both infinite capacity for kindness and terrible potential for cruelty. The difference often lying not in opportunity, but in the fundamental choice between serving oneself and serving something greater than personal gain. Her final reflection on the Easter Garden murder involved the curious resilience of communities that understand their own vulnerability while maintaining faith in their collective decency. St. Mary Mead would continue to welcome visitors and trust in human goodness, but with the hard-won wisdom that came from recognizing how effectively evil could masquerade behind cultured respectability. The eternal struggle between good and evil would continue, resolved not through dramatic confrontations, but through the patient work of ordinary people who understood that civilization depends on the willingness to notice when something seems wrong and to act on that knowledge despite personal risk. In her garden that evening, tending roses that had obliged with a particularly fine showing, Miss Marple reflected that villages, like gardens, required both trust and vigilance to flourish, accepting that some seasons would bring unexpected frosts while maintaining faith that spring would always return for those patient enough to tend what they had been given. The case was closed, justice had been served, and life in St. Mary Mead continued with the quiet satisfaction that comes from duty properly performed and community bonds strengthened through shared trial. Human nature, she concluded, remained endlessly fascinating and occasionally dangerous, but ultimately redeemable through the persistent application of kindness, wisdom, and the sort of careful attention that distinguished between true virtue and its skillful imitation.